So far, we've discussed aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now it's time for full manual exposure mode. Welcome to the Visual Center. I'm Trent. Now this video is somewhat of a culmination because in my last 3 videos we covered the 3 exposure settings on your camera. We discussed how they function and how they affect your final image. Now it's time to learn to use all 3 utilizing manual mode. So what do I mean by manual mode or manual exposure? Depending on the camera you're using, you have a number of exposure modes to choose from. Modes like automatic, manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, or program. Now I'll be discussing some of these other exposure modes in future videos, so be sure to subscribe. Now these various exposure modes are often selected via a button or rotating knob found at the top of your camera. Like on this DSLR, there's a button there that says mode. Alright, this first camera is a Canon 6D. I'm going to turn on the camera, look at my exposure data here on the LCD screen, and turn the mode dial to M for manual exposure. This next camera is a Nikon Z6. Turn the camera on. This is where I see my exposure data. And then the mode dial is over here on the left-hand side, and I turn it to M for manual. This last camera is a Sony A6100. There is no LCD screen, but here's the mode dial. Turn it to M for manual exposure. Now let's get back to answering my original question. When using manual exposure mode, you'll be able to fully control the exposure settings on your camera, or fully control aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. You'll select a combination of values for these 3 variables, and each setting or value you choose will have an effect on your final image. The combination of selections will provide you with a specific brightness for your final image. Or in other words, by setting your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, you'll be in complete control of how bright or dark your images are. Now in the past you may have heard the statement, this image is or is not correctly exposed. Now this term or concept of a correct exposure can be a bit objective or specific. I believe it's more important to create an image in which the correct settings will produce an image which looks the way the photographer intended or how they pre-visualized. So, is the image correctly exposed? If the image looks how you intended it to look, then I would say yes, the image is correctly exposed. Now that being said, I also believe it's important to produce images with exposures that have a good balance of values throughout the image, or images that aren't too dark or too bright. Now there is an indicator built into your camera which will assist you in producing images with well-balanced exposure. This is called the light meter. Now this is what a light meter looks like. Over on the left-hand side where the circle is, that is the light meter. You can see there's indicators moving up and down the meter. They usually can be found in multiple locations on your camera, like on the top LCD, rear display, or most importantly through the viewfinder. The light meter can help you with determining the exposure settings. Now it's very helpful, especially when using manual exposure mode. The indicator at the bottom of the meter moves up and down the scale depending on the amount of light coming into the camera. And that amount of light is controlled by the aperture and shutter speed. The light meter also takes into consideration the current ISO setting. Now oftentimes in order to create a photo where you can see all the detail throughout the image, you'll want to place the bottom indicator near the center point or at the middle of the scale. If the indicator is to the left of the center point, then your camera is indicating that the image will be darker. And each point you move further up to the left, the image will become more darker. And the opposite is true. If the indicator is to the right of the center point, then your camera is indicating that the image will be brighter. And each point you move further to the right, the more bright it will become. Now, like I mentioned in my previous videos on aperture and shutter speed and ISO, there are specific numerical values called full stops. And these larger marks at the top of the scale represent full stops. So if I were to change my aperture 1 full stop from f4 to f5.6, the bottom indicator will move to the left the corresponding full stop mark. So by utilizing the light meter scale, you can determine if you need more or less light coming into your camera, or you need to change your ISO. And you do this by adjusting one of the 3 variables or settings. Now that was a lot of information. And I'll be the first to admit that manual exposure mode is probably the most difficult of all the exposure modes. But the more you use it, the easier it will become. Now one of the difficulties I had when I first started using manual mode on my camera is remembering which numbers of aperture, shutter speed, or ISO will give me more or less light. Instead of memorizing these numbers right away, I found it much easier to watch my light meter and see which way it moved based off of my adjustments of these 3 settings. Now, eventually, this technique created muscle memory, and now when I want to adjust my exposure, my hands and fingers know what to do. Now, let's put all this information together. When you go out to photograph a scene or subject, decide which of the aesthetic qualities of aperture or shutter speed you would like to utilize. A shallow or deep depth of field with aperture, or frozen or blurred action with shutter speed. Pick the aperture or shutter speed, which will provide you with the desired outcome. With your camera pointed at the scene or subject, take a look at the light meter. Do the other settings need to be adjusted in order to produce a better exposure? If the image is too dark, then open your aperture, slow down your shutter speed, or increase your ISO. If the image is too bright, then close down your aperture, increase the shutter speed, or lower your ISO. It's that simple. All right, let's go outside and start shooting, and I'll demonstrate how to create a balanced exposure. So for this first demonstration, I'm going to create a portrait of a friend of mine in front of a white seamless. Now the image is way too dark. The scene is way too dark. The amount of light that I have there isn't enough. So I need to bring my ISO up to 800. And then that's still not enough. So I'm going to bring my shutter speed down to 50th of a second. Now you see I'm shooting at f2.8. That's wide open. So I'm letting as much light as I can through the lens. Looks pretty good. That's a pretty good exposure. So let's check the images. And that was a pretty slow shutter speed, but it looks like the images are sharp. So I'm going to risk going maybe a little bit slower, going to a 25th of a second, and shoot at ISO 400 to reduce the noise created by a higher ISO. Exposure still looks pretty good, but let's check some of the images to make sure they look okay. These look sharp as well. Now I'm shooting on a tripod, so that's why I'm able to go with such a slow shutter speed. I like these images. Now for this next demonstration, I'm out with a friend who's fly fishing and photographing her on the river. Now we're behind a mountain and the sun has gone down a little bit, so it's pretty dark. So I have to bump my ISO all the way up to 1250. I'm also having an aperture of f10 right now because I want a little bit of depth, so you can see a little bit of the detail on the river on the other side, on the shore there. I'm doing 1/100th of a second because I want to freeze a little bit of the action, getting her cast in there. I'm going to recompose and get a little bit closer. Here I need to adjust my exposure again. I brought my ISO down to 100 to get a cleaner image, but I'm going to open up my aperture a bit more. I have to go to f2.8 and go to a 1/250th of a second. Now that's not enough, so I need to bring up my ISO to 320. So I cleaned up my ISO a bit, and I made it a more shallow image with my aperture. And I'm getting fast enough shutter speed to still freeze that action of her casting and the water moving. Now this next part is where the dog gets out of the water and actually runs into me, and then runs into me again, and I fall over. But here are some of the images from that shoot. So I think they turned out well. I like the depth, I like the frozen motion, I like the composition when I recompose the image there. All right, for this last demonstration, I am up a canyon shooting cars driving up and down a canyon just after sunset. So since it's just after sunset, the sky is getting darker, so I need to bring my ISO up because it's a little bit underexposed still. I need to slow my shutter speed down. I'm going to try to get the headlights and taillights of the car streaking through the image. So I'm going to bring my shutter speed way down to a few seconds. Now I'm looking at my light meter. I'm zeroed out there. So my light meter is saying this is the correct exposure for this scene. So 5 seconds, f2.8 at ISO 800. So I'm going to compose. I'm going to zoom in a bit. Take my first photo. And it's a little too bright. That's not how I envisioned the photo. So my light meter was a good start. I'm going to ignore it now and change the exposure a bit. I'm going to make it a little darker by lowering my ISO and see what that gets me. I'm going to zoom in here on the road. See, there's a little broken streak of the red tail lights on that side of the road. I want to try to get a solid streak through the frame. So I'm going to slow down my shutter speed for this next image, and that should create a longer exposure. So now I'm at 15 seconds. I'm actually going to bump it up to 20 seconds at f5.6 at ISO 200. So because I adjusted my shutter speed, I now need to adjust my aperture. That looks pretty good. I like that image. I'm going to check the noise, make sure it's not too noisy. But other than that, I think it's a successful image. I'm happy with it. Now, I hope those demonstrations helped you see how to adjust aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to create images using manual exposure mode. Now, what questions or difficulties have you had or do you have when using manual mode? Let me know in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for video notifications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Now it's time for manual exposure mode. Oh, yeah, I'm excited.